Rich Basofin. I'm part of Mike's posse. I haven't worked on 100 projects, but a number of projects with Mike following a career in corporate consulting. We were working on a project for a client during which the CFO quit, and I sort of flunked retirement, became the CFO for 5 years, and now I'm back with the ESC. I currently am president of the board of a private sector organization, social service, and I'm the president of the board of a public sector governmental organization.
Good morning, I'm Natasha Egan from the Museum of Contemporary Photography. I'm the executive director and have been the executive director for maybe 8 years, but I was the associate director and chief curator before that since 2000. So I've been at this organization a very long time. We have an advisory board, it's a little bit different than a governing board. I know today's different governing boards, but many of our board members, or several of our board members, I should say, also serve on the board of trustees of Columbia College, which is our parent organization. So I work very closely with the board. I learned a lot from Dr. Rogers. I feel like I've been through a little bit of a boot camp and have some prescriptions that I'm taking. But so we'll talk about some of those ideas.
Good morning. I'm Gayla Brockman. I'm the president and CEO of the Michael Reese Health Trust. Before I came to Chicago 2.5 years ago, I ran a large healthcare foundation in Kansas City for 12 years. I had a board of 22. I worked in a hospital and worked with the board at a hospital. Prior to that, I've also served as a board member in several different capacities. So I've been on both sides of the fence, but now I work with a board of 17 and have dealt with board mergers. So I've experienced doing a variety of different kinds of board activities on both sides.
Good morning as well. My name is Don Schwartz. I spell it with a T to differentiate myself. In corporate land, I served on industry and internal boards. After leaving corporate America, I went to Loyola University. Never thought of that. They are a basketball powerhouse, by the way. I worked at Funding School where I ran the Center for Risk Management and Corporate Governance. And I co-published a book that didn't even reach the Pioneer Press bestseller list. But it was a book entitled Corporate Boards, Managers of Risk, Sources of Risk.
I've already been introduced, so.
Well, thanks to all of you for joining us this morning. Dave, let's start with you for our first question. What are the most difficult issues for boards to address? What helps them address these issues in a productive way?
On the boards I've been on, the most difficult issues we struggled with was evaluating our executive director or superintendent, and if the evaluation, indicated that the board thought that the performance was lacking, trying to come up with a strategy to improve the performance of the director, or eventually to terminate the director and find a replacement that would do a better job. And those experiences, I hated it, and it was really difficult for the board and, of course, for the director, who you want to treat with respect. But ultimately, you're, as a board member, your purpose is to serve the organization and not the director, and so it can create some real heartaches.
Are we all going, or are we just? Okay, any other comments on that? Okay. I guess the next question we'd ask the group, and Mike, I guess if you want to handle this one, that boards, that may have many similarities to each other. Some boards, however, have unique situations to address in their organizations. What are some of the unique challenges that you see? from your experience?
So I identified 4. I'm guessing that other people might have others too. The first one I determined was ex officio board members. So oftentimes, these are board members that are appointed by either members of the organization, or they're appointed by a religious congregation. Maybe your organization was founded by a religious congregation, or has a religious congregation connection. So different congregations are going to appoint members. So you don't really have any control over the mix of people that are on your board. You get handed board members. The second point, and it's sort of related to what Dave was talking about, is elected boards. We do a good bit of work here at ESC with elected boards, and oftentimes the board doesn't have any control. I mean, the board never has any control over who the populace is going to, who the electorate is going to vote in on the board. So you can get some pretty recalcitrant board members, or you can get some one-issue board members who have a particular point that they just want to make sure they raise at every single board meeting, regardless of what the objective is. I think that a third category that I came up with is when you've got big funders on boards. So if one of your board members or 2 of your board members are the most significant funders, then there's a real possibility that everybody else is going to be discounted in terms of what their opinion or what their influence is, because everyone's turning to the big funders. They can drive the agenda really easily, and it may not be the direction that the organization really wants to or needs to go. The last category I came up with is membership organizations. We've done a little bit of work with membership organizations where the member companies or the members actually get to elect or appoint the board. So again, you've got a situation where the board itself doesn't really have any control over who's on the board. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts about that, or any other categories that you might have.
Yeah, go ahead.
In your question there, you have some of the unique challenges that you've seen, and not to usurp. I think the nonprofit landscape is littered with overcapacity. And I think it's very probable in the future that boards will have to look at, to survive, how do we consolidate? And with who do we consolidate? And what structure would be put into place? So I think one of the things going forward is the board involvement in consolidation, and particularly post-consolidation integration.
Okay. Next question. How do you help people with many diverse characteristics come together to work effectively as a board?
It's tough. And we want diversity in boards, diversity in backgrounds, diversity in experience. The boards I'm involved with look for board members that are representative of the community or the clients that we serve. And so diversity is a good thing, but similarity is a good thing as well. We want board members that are passionate about the mission, no matter what their background is. And we look for that when we recruit board members. And we get people to work together relative to that mission by going through strategic planning processes, goal setting, getting people on the same page, so that no matter how different they are, we all approach this with a single goal. The private sector board I'm on has 6 board meetings a year, 4 of which are early morning at the organization's offices, and 2 of which are dinner meetings in a more of a social setting. And this was mentioned earlier. We get people to know each other and know their backgrounds and find a way to work together. Sometimes we go through team building exercises, but those are the kinds of things we do to get people on the same page.
Any other comments on that?
Yes. I wanted to add, I appreciate the comment talking about team building and just ways of helping people to learn how to work together. One of the things that I've found sometimes, you can't hear?
No.
Do you hear now?
Yeah.
There we go. All right. Sometimes people see differences and assume that what the visible difference is means a whole nother set of kinds of differences. I was a co-presenter with a woman that does a lot of training with my center, who's a social worker. Her expertise is in the area of communication, and we did a workshop earlier this year about communicating across differences. And we were just talking about how with race and gender and other kinds of outwardly visible differences, there is sometimes, people kind of bump up against each other and think that it is that diversity element that is the reason for the conflict, when it may be personality. And sometimes when you have the opportunity to have some interventions that are exploring what are folks' different styles, leadership styles, and personality and engagement, that you can find some strategies to work together. You acknowledge the visible characteristics because that's important, that's folks' identity, but also developing strategies of figuring out how you're gonna work together because you're all sitting at the same table.
And one of the other things I would talk about is ESC's got some really excellent tools that we've used in several different projects on team coaching and have really found great ways to help organizations and boards identify the difference between what they say is really important to them and what turns out to be really important to them in terms of how they're actually operating and what the differences are and how to get them, how to help them create plans to close those gaps or to improve their team dynamics.
Oh, sorry. Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to add something that I've noticed. For those of you who've met my husband, you know he's a member of a minority community, and it never crossed his mind to serve on a nonprofit board. I think a lot of people's interaction with nonprofits, besides in the academic setting, only comes about through, let's say, cancer outreach, for example. I was volunteering with an organization, and I knew that his corporation where he worked provided several $1,000s per executive in charitable giving to organizations where the executive served on the board. And I knew he cared about an organization and was a little bit involved as a volunteer, and it had literally never crossed his mind because he, in his small prism, he didn't know anybody who served on nonprofit boards, certainly no one that looked like him. And I suggested it to him, and he didn't feel comfortable recommending himself to that board. So I called the executive director of the organization and mentioned it to her, and she called the governance chair, and they met, and he's been on the board for years, and he loves it. So I think something that we can all do as we have people in our lives that represent diverse populations, and it doesn't, in this case, it's a cultural, it's a different cultural background, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that. Something that we can all do is to think about what that person's skill set is, what organizations they might be passionate about, and just reach out to them and say, I'm not the governance chair of that board, but I see you have this awesome skill set. I know you'd be an asset to that organization, and you should consider it. Because it might not have ever crossed their mind that that was a place where their talents and skills could be highlighted and used and appreciated. So it's something that we can all just think about and work on together, because it's not a problem that's going to be solved automatically. But the more our organization's leadership in terms of boards are diverse, the more our organizations are going to be able to meet the needs of our incredibly diverse community. So I'll get off my soapbox, but I'm just going to say we should all work on it.
I may have read this question slightly differently, and maybe some of you have as well, but I took it as, and I'm going to use an example that we did as a group to bring a somewhat divided board together. We, and this sounds so dry, but let me tell you, it brought a board together. We revisited our bylaws that hadn't been touched in 20 years. And by revisiting something that seemed dry, it brought a board together in the most interesting of ways. We looked at term limits, which it seemed so dry, and the way we were constructed, and committees, and the way positions officer positions and chairs of committees were constructed, and everybody got involved in the board. Everybody had a voice on how the board was constructed, how the committees were constructed, how term limits were constructed, how long you were a board member. It changed everything, and everybody came together under the infrastructure of a board. And all of a sudden, it was a we conversation and not an us versus them conversation. So I have a board member here, and he's just raised his hand. Would you like to say something about that experience?
I would. I happen to sit on the board that Gayla was talking about, and there's one very important thing that she neglected to mention. Not only did we revisit our bylaws, but we revisited our mission and vision statements. And that was a tremendous help in bringing the organization's diverse, well, I guess diverse is the best way to describe it, diverse elements into one cohesive group that is now all headed in the same direction. We have a little thing that some of us carry around with us. It's a little paddle, and we're now all rowing in the same direction. It's just a little gimmick, but it's been extremely helpful. It's a vision that we have.
So think about the mundane of how your organization operates, and think about the infrastructure. I mean, these are simple things to do that you have in your back pocket, and it's interesting because it gets people excited about how you run your organizations, and everybody wants to be part of that, and it becomes a we again, or it can be.
Good discussion. Let's see, Natasha, I don't know if you want to handle this one. We want to talk a little bit, we talked about strategic planning is one of the major activities that we at ESC do. When a board revises a strategic plan, do you have any thoughts on how far the timeline should be extended? Is it, a year, 5 years, 10 years? Have you ever been involved with strategic planning?
I have, and I neglected to mention this in my introduction, that I'm happy to see 3 of the members from ESC here in the audience, Eleanor included, who helped the Museum of Contemporary Photography with our most recent strategic plan. We just finished it, I guess, in January. Is that correct? And it was a really great experience. I want to reiterate what you also just said about the mundane and the board. Well, the quick answer is 3 to 5 years, I think, is the opportune time to. I think it would be too long if you reach too far into the future. But I wanted to reiterate that by just even organizing the strategic plan brought our board together, and the ESC consultants did an amazing job of facilitating the discussions. We also, like your organization, re-looked at our mission and our vision. And those are things that you probably will last longer than 3 to 5 years. Maybe you don't need to do that every 3 to 5 years, but the strategy itself, I think it was we decided on, we did a 5-year plan, but we set up 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year, 5 year timeline goals. Some of them really immediate for operations, and with goals set to kind of achieve, to increase our revenue, hopefully within the next couple of years, and other much longer term projects of hopefully even redesigning the space, which doesn't happen as quickly. That takes a capital campaign. So that's within our strategic plan, is to then make the plan for a capital campaign with some timeline in there too. So I say 3 to 5 years, short answer.
Okay. What are the best characteristics for a board member to demonstrate?
Well, there's probably many, but I quickly came up with about a handful of some of the things that I cherish in our board members. Certainly passion for the mission is important, but for a generic list of board members that serve us well are those who are willing to voice their opinion, who are willing to speak up, those who are also willing to listen, and those who are consensus driven.
Dealt with the situation where you maybe have a board member who's really overbearing.
Louder, Tim.
Sorry.
I hear you.
Wondering if you dealt in situations where you have a board member who's very overbearing, seems to be very dominant, driving things, the board maybe kind of going down their path versus the organization's path. I see some smiles up there, so that's the first time. What kinds of things do you do? Because you can't necessarily throw people off the board or say you're fired or anything like that. How do you handle situations like that? Oh, it was our president who probably fired.
I'm happy to start, but I'm sure you all have input. Well, first of all, I think it's very important that as the president and CEO, I work very closely with my chair to plan meetings in advance so that we anticipate and we already know who those players are and who they're going to be in a meeting. And I counsel and work closely with my chair so that we know how to manage that in a meeting. I believe in a very strong chair, and I've been very blessed to have very strong chairs who will manage that. I always sit very close to my chair and nudge them under the table when I think a conversation needs to be moved along. And fortunately, he or she has responded to that nudge. But you know, in my opinion, honestly, those polarizing board members, you might call them, or strong, opinionated board members are those board members that we all need on our board to raise the bar. And I think we have much to learn from board members who have strong opinions, because sometimes they make us better. So it's good to hear them. It's good to manage them. I think they need to be on a board, but you always need to have a strong leader who is planning and anticipates them and manages them and knows how to cut them off.
I'm just going to reiterate, I've had some experience where when that particular board member can't make one meeting and you feel the absence, but then everyone rises to kind of fill it, and then the next time the person's there, people have already risen to. So I don't know if it's a way to like plan a meeting when you know they're on vacation once. But the change was kind of dramatic with them not being there once, but then when they came back, they were missed in a way, because you get a little bit used to that personality. But then so how do you grow the members around to be more comfortable? One way worked that they happened to not be there, and so the other shyer personalities grew out of that, and then were stronger the next time. But there's other ways. I think it's also just conversation and communication.
Sounds like the strategy is to give that person a different schedule of board meetings.
Good plan. Okay, Don, maybe you can handle this one. What have you experienced as best practices or strategies in regard to board member recruitment?
Most of you are highly experienced, so I'm not going to state what you already know. So what I'll do is give you my biases. The first thing is, board recruitment is a board, not a staff function. I'm very suspicious when the ED serves up prospective board members. I think the board function is to recruit. The second, I'm always concerned when the chair does all the recruiting. I am of the belief that the board should have a committee that is responsible for recruiting. Clearly, things like transparency, expectations, and when you are recruiting a board member, things like board packets, but one thing that needs to be in that board packet is the board member contract. What are you signing on to do? So, those are my comments.
Okay, and while we're on the topic of recruitment, Can you share ways in which boards can ensure diversity and inclusion when recruiting members?
So, since everybody looked to me, let me just say something about that too. There is a value for something called allies. People know that term?
Mm-hmm.
So that it is not just the other person who is looked to do the recruiting of the whoever is looked to be diverse. So I just want to put that out there. That's something that's really, really important. So I'll say that. What I was going to say before that question got posed, however, was about just overall recruitment. And bottom line, person connected to mission, right? But beyond that, I'm on a nominating committee for one of the boards that I'm on. And the process that we use is when we do research on board prospective candidates. So we find folks who know the person, and so we can talk to their network about the person and the possibility of that person's service. So we're looking at things like their analytical skills, their kind of self-starter nature, their communication skills, the extent to which they are kind of bridging folks, not divisive folks. But we're looking at those kinds of things. I've also found it's really, really important, and you referenced the board contract, that folks know very clearly what the expectations are, because so often that is not made explicit. They are not told what a give and get is. They're not told that they're expected to be at board meetings physically, that it's not something that they can Skype in or kind of saunter in whenever they feel like it. So really laying out those expectations is something that's really important as a part of that recruitment process.
Very good. This kind of relates to the question that Don handled. As far as new board members, what are some of the best practices? Maybe Dave, you could handle this one, or from your experience, what are some of the best practices involving or onboarding or orientation of new members?
From my experience, we've tried to have a standard collection of materials that we can provide the new board member. In some areas, it can be kind of arcane. You know, if you have a new school board member coming on to try to explain to them Illinois school financing, you know, almost need a PhD in public administration before you can get very far. There's the broad background information you need to give them and meet with them and answer their questions in person. And then there's the more direct thing. They will jump right into being a voting member, and they will need to know what happened at the last meeting and the meeting before that. And so to try to sit down with people and bring them up to speed is an effort that takes some time, and it takes somebody with a lot of background in the organization.
I would just add a couple of things, I think, to that. Those of you who have been on projects with me know that I'm a maniac about table tents with names on them. And I use those in meetings, and I think that's really a best practice for boards. It's really hard when somebody comes on to a new board, particularly if there's a lot of board members and they don't have any idea who else is in the room or what their names are. I'm also a maniac about handing out board lists that have pictures and bios on them. Because I think for coming on to a new board, if you don't have a sense of who's on the board, or you don't have a picture of what they look like, it's really hard to get comfortable with them, because you can't really expect somebody to walk into a room with 20 new people and go around and introduce yourself and then remember who they all are. A couple of other points I would make that maybe relate more to one of the prior questions, but are tangential to this question too, is to the extent that you've used non-board members on committees as a pipeline for future board members, I think that can also help with the diversity recruiting, and it can also help with having people coming onto the board who already know who the board members are and already know what the board expectations are, so you're not walking into a vacuum like you typically do. And one of the other opinions I have, which is perhaps a little controversial, is I get confused or disappointed, I guess, when I see boards that are constantly bringing on people throughout the year. I really like the idea of a class of board members that comes on once a year so that everybody can go through an orientation and can get to be connected to the board all at one time. So those are just a couple of points.
Okay, back there and then up here.
Yeah, some people have mentioned this, but the idea of an assigned mentor, an experienced board member to a new one, is really engaging for both parties. So when something comes up at the board meeting and the new person has no clue as to what it is, they can ask offline, and they have a person to go to. And the mentor checks in between board meetings. It's been very invaluable in terms of retention, more so than recruiting. And you know, the other thing is committees as a pipeline, as well as advisory boards, if appropriate. Advisory boards whose expertise is, you know, on the stuff of the organization, but then can maybe move into the governance aspect. It depends on the organization, if that's something you want to create or already have. But that's another good pathway to the governing board.
Occasionally, ESC gets involved with a national board or a regional board where the meetings are held through teleconference and they're not, people are not live. I'm just wondering if that's.
Can't hear 'em back here.
Experience in teaching these remote board people engaged in the meetings are not live, whether or not participating.
We couldn't hear that back here.
The question was about national boards or regional boards where people aren't in the same room for many of the meetings. They're participating by teleconference.
There, hand out back there? Did you have your hand up?
Answer is.
Okay. Anybody else? Yeah?
Well, I just had a comment on
Renee?
that many times we work with a board, the board doesn't understand what the roles and responsibilities are. And sometimes the executive director doesn't understand the roles and responsibilities. And the tool I found very helpful is from Board Source, which lists the top 10 responsibilities of a board of directors. Many times we hand that out to the board, and it's enlightening, and they didn't realize.
It's an excellent resource. In fact, Butch Felser is recommended for all of our board members coming on. It's an excellent.
We've used that in the past here at ESC in our board development course.
Go ahead.
I've been on many boards, or most of the boards that have had to deal with as many as 13 or more states where we're dealing with board members via teleconference. And often we can't afford to do, say, a video one where you can see each other. So one of the key things is that everybody's bio has already been shared. And at the time when anybody needs to speak, they should always say who they are and where they reside. In other words, what state or what organization that they are part of when talking. That way, there's something that the listeners can pull from that to know what that culture might be there because of what the answer of the question is. So once that's shared, it tends to bring things together where you can start to communicate in a viable manner so you know who to go to for what, or what to share side opinions on or ask questions about that may not get brought out just because you can't see each other.
Joan Geary is an expert in the nonprofit world. Some of you may be familiar with her, and she's done a number of videotapes. We have every new board member watch a video, Joan Geary video on roles and responsibilities of boards. It's been very effective.
Anybody else on that topic? All right, we're gonna have to finish up. Believe it or not, we have lots more questions, but we're cutting it short because everybody has such great things to say. Does anyone have any general questions they'd like to ask our panel since we have them here before we stop?
Term limits are very controversial in politics, of course. I was an alderman for 24 years. I don't know what that says. Until I joined the nonprofit ESC group, I never heard term limits brought up in terms of nonprofit boards. I'm on a couple of boards. I'm one of them. I'm quite senior, but nobody had ever mentioned term limits. I would like to ask the panel, is there anyone who was very much in favor of term limits, much against it? Just a tool
All right, why don't we start down there and just go this way?
They've already voted.
So I'm in favor of term limits because I think it affords an opportunity. A question over here about like a toxic board member. Worst comes to worst, there's always that out to get rid of somebody or someone who's really not engaged. So that's one reason. Also, just to allow the opportunity to refresh folks on the board. There are term limits such that I'm on a board where we have two-year terms, so we have to go off. But there's other boards where there's term limits and there's an option of renewal. But the point is, it gives an opportunity, it sets some parameters. If a person feels like, okay, I've done my service, I can't do it anymore, but I don't feel comfortable just kind of going away, there's a structure. Or if you want to get rid of somebody politely, there's a structure. And it can be exercised in a stringent fashion or ignored. But if it's there, it's fine. I've heard the other side, people say, oh, but you'll lose the history and all of that. There's other ways of engaging folks. You can have emeritus folks. There's other ways.
I second everything that you just said, absolutely. And it just gives the next generation opportunities to get on the board, have board experience, and move on. I think it's the discipline imposed that you have in the corporate structure should be the same in not-for-profit structure.
Can I?
I'll take both of them. I'm of two minds on this, but I pretty much have come down on terms and not term limits. And the terms are terms that really get applied, and people get voted on for a second or subsequent term, and the people that are doing a fine job can stay on for 24 years or however long that might be. Board I'm on has annual discussions with each board member. This year done by the board chair. And we coach people and we talk about what they're doing well and what they're not doing well and whether they're still a good fit on the board. The term limit thing, I've got a mixed set of issues with that.
Anybody else on the panel? Or any comments out there? Yeah.
Butch had his hand up earlier.
No, that's all right, it's been covered.
Okay.
One question. On the term limit issue, what do you do if the executive director likes to have no term limits because that allows better the ED to better control the board?
Look at your bylaws.
It's not the executive director's choice.
All right. All right, well, thank you all so much. This has been such an enlightening discussion. We appreciate your coming and giving your time and allowing people to jump in and talk as well. Thanks so much.